Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the introductory lecture. So let's jump right into the glossary. And like I was saying before, a lot of this is just understanding some of the important job titles or roles that are involved in the making of a movie. So this is one of the key distinctions that we have to make between literature and film. Of course, most works of literature are written independently. There are some exceptions, but generally authors work alone. Now, we can't forget the role their editors play, especially when it comes to novels, but most of the artistic work is getting done by the author. The author typically works more or less alone. So it's not difficult when we're trying to sort of give credit or attribute choices to a particular person. We have the author, we have a name that we can always refer back to. With film, though, it is a little bit different because film is very collaborative. We already know that. A lot of people are involved in the making of a movie. Often for a casual viewer, we probably think about actors first and foremost. We think about the actors portraying the characters in the film, and that's fine. We can always talk about acting, and also by thinking about the actors, we can work with character. We can think about characterization, which is one of those literary elements that we've worked with before. So we can always explore individual characters, what they do, what they mean, how we're supposed to feel about them. That's always fine. But we need to push beyond just the actors in the film, and we need to think about the people behind the scenes, some of the really important creative forces behind the movie. So let's start with the director. Okay, this is the closest thing we have to an author. Again, not quite the same because the director relies on a lot of other people, and the director is collaborating with a lot of the other people that I'm about to list and mention here. But we can consider the director to really be the unifying force behind a film. The one who makes the majority, not all, but the majority of the creative decisions. The director is sort of the biggest name of them all. So if you notice on the syllabus in our schedule, when I'm listing all of our films, I mention the name of the director, just like I would mention the author of a novel or a short story. So we are kind of treating the director in that way, and I'll often talk about directors' styles and, their different backgrounds. But there are a lot of other areas that we can explore, and just remember that directors are working with the screenwriter, the cinematographer, oftentimes the editor. They're working with a lot of other people to create the film. Now, in some cases, and this was especially true back in the golden era of the big studios, a lot of directors were kind of guns for hire. They would be brought on to direct a film well after the screenplay had been written. A lot of the pre-production was already done, like they had already cast the movie. They were ready to start shooting. They were ready to start principal photography, and the director would just kind of come in and get right to work. And that was common back in the old days because the studios had everybody on long-term contracts. I forgot to mention that before, but that was part of how they exerted so much control over all three levels of filmmaking. The actors were under contract, the cameramen, the lighting guys, pretty much everybody, and that included the directors. So a lot of directors would just come in to shoot a movie. They might work, they would be known often for working kind of efficiently and just getting it done, very much just sort of technicians. We might think of them as a little bit more kind of, just sort of doing more of a technical job rather than maybe a super artistic expression. But that was common back in the golden age. In the 60s, though, and 70s, we started to sort of change our perspective of directors. Now, a lot of that had to do with some of the changes I mentioned before that were happening in the late 60s into the 70s. That's a period that's often called the New American Cinema, because there were a lot of innovations. There were a lot of changes that were happening in American filmmaking during that decade. So this was a period of experimentation, innovation, obviously a lot of drug use, but you also have this concept that had already existed in Europe. It's actually a French term, but it started to get applied more and more to American filmmakers, this idea of an auteur. An auteur is a filmmaker, a director, who sort of got his hands on all aspects of the film. I guess we could think of it as just like a complete artist. Somebody who is the opposite of a gun for hire who just comes in to shoot the movie. Oftentimes, auteurs would have maybe written their own screenplays. They might be very involved in the camera work or other sort of technical aspects of the film. They might have a hand in editing the film. Some directors are kind of involved at every point, at every level in that way. And during the 70s, we started thinking of a lot of directors as auteurs, started using that term for directors like Francis Ford Coppola, who did The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, George Lucas, who's of course famous for Star Wars, but also did American Graffiti, which was a big hit in the 70s, Sam Peckinpah, who kind of revolutionized Westerns, made them kind of modern and violent, and had really sort of modern camera work in films like The Wild Bunch. Martin Scorsese, who's still around, but he broke through in the 70s with Mean Streets, and sort of developed a reputation as an auteur. Later, of course, would do, Goodfellas and all kinds of other big films, and still making films today. Most of these other guys are dead. Robert Altman was another big one from the 70s. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or maybe is it Miller and Mrs. McCabe? I always get that title wrong. He did MASH, the movie version of MASH. Arthur Penn, who did Bonnie and Clyde. So those were all examples of auteurs. That was kind of the way they were talked about. Not all of them wrote their own screenplays, and not all of them were sort of in charge of cinematography and editing, but they were just thought of as artists who had this kind of complete artistic vision. And again, with filmmakers like them, you can really talk about their style. They had a distinctive artistic style, whereas a lot of the guns for hire back in the 40s and 50s, they were just churning out the movies. They maybe didn't have as much of an artistic style of their own, but these auteurs in the 70s did. So again, a lot of the independent filmmakers that we're going to be studying took a lot of their cues from that 1970s group, that generation that really helped to define new American cinema. They had new visual techniques. They were irreverent, more frank depictions of violence and sex and drug use, more realistic portrayals of American life, but they were also very artistically innovative. And a lot of that meant importing techniques and new styles from Europe, from art cinema, stuff that, again, was outside of the traditional Hollywood studio model. So all of that helped to set the stage for what Pearson's talking about and what we start to see when we begin our tour in the 80s. So we still, that sort of idea of the auteur, it's still kind of with us today. We think of directors like maybe Quentin Tarantino that way. An older guy like Orson Welles, who did Citizen Kane, he's often thought of that way. Some people dispute the notion that any director is really an auteur, because virtually no director is doing everything. They always collaborate. They always have other people making important decisions. But it stayed with us because, again, we like to think of the artist. We like to have a name. We like to have a face that we can associate with the artistry, the creation that we are analyzing. So we can still use the director in that way, whether we believe in the auteur idea or not, the complete filmmaker idea. We don't have to buy into it, but we should know the directors for all of these films, and I'll talk about them each during my weekly lectures. Screenwriter, we pretty much can understand this role. Every movie starts as a screenplay, as a script. But some movies will emphasize their screenplays more than others. So, like I stated before, some directors will write their own screenplays. So that makes it kind of easy. You have one person who's responsible for both screenwriting and directing. In other cases, the director might work closely with the screenwriter, but the screenwriter is still kind of creating the script somewhat independently. Some screenwriters become famous in their own right, and oftentimes successful screenwriters will get a chance to direct their own films eventually. Sometimes that works out. Sometimes it doesn't. So just a few examples. John Milius was a famous screenwriter who worked with Francis Ford Coppola back in the 70s. Eventually, he made his own films. Paul Schrader is a really good example. He worked with Scorsese early in their respective careers. I want to say he wrote the screenplay for Taxi Driver and some other big hits for Scorsese, and then he went on to be a very successful director in his own right. Schrader did. In more contemporary times, we have Charlie Kaufman, who you might have heard of. He's fairly famous as a screenwriter. He's also directed his own films. A really good example for those of you who are familiar with his work is Taylor Sheridan, who I believe is the creative force behind the Yellowstone fictive universe, which is very extensive. But Sheridan he started out as an actor, sort of a character actor, didn't get a lot of big roles, but was a working actor for a long time. And then he wrote the screenplays to a couple of very successful movies, including Sicario, and I believe Hell and High Water. There's probably some others I'm forgetting. Wind River with Jeremy Renner might have been another one. But he became successful through his work on those films. And then eventually, I'm not sure if he's directed any films of his own by now. Maybe he has. I'm honestly not sure. But he might still really just be a writer. But he used that early screenwriting to success to create this huge TV franchise, which is obviously doing quite well. So another example of somebody who becomes famous as a screenwriter and then sort of goes on to do bigger things. Okay, so if you really are interested in the language of a film, if you're really struck by the dialogue, if you think it's really just noteworthy or realistic or moving, affecting in some way, then yeah, you're going to want to dig into that screenplay a little bit. And one cool thing is you can often find the complete screenplays for films online for free. Not always, but you often can. So if you ever want to conduct a little close reading or a little bit of a closer examination of a screenplay, you can usually do that. And if you ever need help trying to track one down, I can try to assist. And that's always something that you can do. Again, if you want to conduct some of the same close reading of language that you might do in a traditional lit class, doing that really means that you want to dig into the screenplay and think more about the screenplay and the role that it serves. Okay, so moving on, we have to talk a little bit about visuals when we talk about film. So I do want you guys to be at least sort of familiar, just acquainted with the idea of cinematography. So cinematography is a very general term that just sort of refers to the camera work of a film. So this really sort of governs what we see, and that's obviously a big part of a movie viewing experience. So you don't have to be an expert in cinematography, you don't have to know a ton, but you should be observant and you should notice certain sort of general things about the camera work. Some cinematographers will actually operate the camera themselves, while others simply design and supervise, and they have camera operators working under them. So one thing I included in the glossary was just some key elements of cinematography, just some additional terms and concepts that you guys might want to be familiar with. Again, you don't have to use all of this stuff, but if you are struck by the camera work of a particular film and you want to talk about it, you want to write about it, you want to make some points about it, you need to get specific and use some of this language, some of these specific terms. So we start with point of view. So again, the camera will often give us a very specific point of view. That's the position from which a person, object, or event is filmed. So sometimes, that point of view is going to dictate how we interpret a visual. It's going to determine how we feel, our emotional state. It's also going to determine what we see and the amount of information that we might be able to acquire. So there's a lot of different types of points of view, but a subjective point of view is usually thought to sort of recreate a character's perspective or somebody who is participating in the action, while an objective point of view represents a more impersonal perspective. There's more distance involved oftentimes. So if it's a subjective point of view, we're often seeing things like we were there. We're getting the point of view of a character or somebody who's involved in the action. Whereas if we're getting an objective point of view, we might be more distant. We might be more removed from the action, and we kind of have like a bird's eye view, something that's more detached, but we can still maybe see more. We can take in more, but we're perhaps at a greater distance. So you need to kind of just have a general sense of the point of view. Does this look like the perspective of a character, or does this look like the perspective of a bird or God looking from above? Just some general things like that will help you to make some further decisions in your analysis. Now, if we're talking about a camera shot, I'll often refer to individual shots when I'm talking about a movie. So we need to know what a shot is. So basically, we're just talking about a series of frames that run for an uninterrupted period of time. In other words, this is basically the duration from the point at which the camera starts rolling until the point where it stops. And this is an individual shot is going to be separated from other shots by cuts. And that's something that's done during the editing process, during post-production. So I want you guys to start paying attention to the duration of individual shots in a movie. Because one thing you'll notice if you're watching a modern movie, especially one like a popular mainstream, big studio movie, the shots are usually very, very short. I'm talking maybe on average somewhere between like 3 to 5 seconds in most contemporary filmmaking. And that's often going to be true with TV shows, music videos, other sort of contemporary styles of visual storytelling. Because we have short attention spans and we like to keep things moving. We want to see different things. So typically shots are very short. And again, you're going to notice a cut, right? As one image goes away and it's replaced by another image. So this is often very seamless, right? Editing is done at such a high level, we're not really supposed to always notice the cuts. We're not supposed to necessarily notice when one shot ends and the next one begins, because that is a little bit distracting if we're trying to just follow the plot. But if this is a movie that you're planning to really dig into and work with extensively and closely, you might want to start breaking it down into individual shots, thinking about some distinctive or noteworthy shots that just sort of make an impression on you or seem to carry some really important meaning. And again, you can always go back and rewind, rewatch certain parts, and you might be able to do some close work with individual shots. So if we're thinking about any individual camera shot, there are 4 kind of basic attributes that we can also consider, the 4 basic attributes of a camera shot. So these are all different things that we can talk about when we are talking about that particular shot. So we can start with framing. we can think about framing as one of the key attributes of the shot. So every shot in a movie is carefully constructed and framed by the cinematographer, and sometimes the cinematographer might be working in conjunction with the director. But the framing generally means like we have some kind of limit being imposed to our field of vision, right? So this is sort of directing our vision. It's determining often our point of view. It's giving us sort of borders. It's giving us a height and a width through which we can, comprehend the visual image. So all of this stuff has to get planned out and considered. The framing determines the size of the shot, the distance, the angle of what we're seeing. So all of that matters. And included within framing is going to be a lot of the individual types of shots that we see. So often we define different kinds of shots based on the framing. So for example, a close-up, right, versus a long shot. Those are going to largely be determined by how they're framed. So a close-up, you're in close on somebody's face, right? Whereas with a long shot, you're going to be able to see their entire body. So we have a different height, a different width, a different sort of perspective being captured, right? Then we have a medium close-up where we have the head and maybe the shoulders. So that creates a different frame. That creates a different sort of field of vision, that creates a different image for the audience. So if we're talking about close-ups, medium shots, and long shots, those are all kind of based on framing. A typical medium shot of a person, would be like from the waist or maybe from the hips up. So we might start with a medium shot of a person as they enter a room so we can see who they are. And then when they start having a conversation with another person in the room, we might have rapid close-ups. We might be cutting back and forth between their faces. Right? If you ever watch a conversation unfold, often you're going to get some close-ups. You might get some over-the-shoulder shots. Again, a subjective point of view, almost like you're the other person in the conversation. You can kind of see the person talking, addressing you directly. You're kind of seeing it from the other character's perspective, right? And then you might get really tight on the face for some of those shots. Then we might zoom out and get a little bit of a different frame. But that's very common, and that's how we could progress easily from shot to shot. We go from that medium shot, introducing a person, to a bunch of closer shots of that person, doing something else. But that's usually how that logical sort of cause and effect chain gets constructed, often at the beginning of a film, right? When we're establishing our location, our setting, we might get some big long shots. We might get some overhead shots. So we can see a skyline, we can see a street, we can see a house. We get progressively smaller with our framing as we move along, as we cut to look to the future shots. We might get inside the house. Now we have medium shots and close-ups of people, right? And that's usually how that stuff works. We can also notice angles. Different camera angles will create different frames. Right? So we have high angles. That's when we're looking down on the action from up above. And then we can also notice low angles. That's when we are looking up at the action from down below. So that will also influence our field of vision, the height, the width, and what we're actually seeing on the screen. Okay? So that's the first key attribute of a camera shot, is the framing. And again, framing will determine stuff like close-ups versus medium shots versus long shots, and then high angle versus low angle. All right, the second key attribute is depth of field. And this is used to create different depths and to, again, sort of subtly shape our understanding of an image as we're watching on screen. So we can have what's called deep focus, which means that multiple things within the image, multiple planes, will be in focus and clearly visible. We can also have shallow focus, and that's when only a narrow range of field is in focus. So this is going to control what we can see and what we can see clearly. Maybe we can only see what's right in front of us, and whatever is behind that person is unclear, out of focus, and perhaps blurry. Whereas we might also be able to see for a much further distance. We might be able to see what's in the foreground and in the background, depending on what kind of depth of field we're seeing in that particular camera shot. So that's attribute number 2. Attribute number 3 is contrast and color. So this doesn't matter quite as much today as it did a long time ago, because now almost all of the films we watch are in color, but not all. And not all the films that we watch in this class are going to be in color. So when we're comparing color formats to black and white formats, sometimes color and contrast really do come into play. And even if we're just thinking about color films, color still matters. If we're thinking about shooting locations, if we're thinking about set decoration, if we're thinking about the costumes that actors wear, all of that will constitute a sort of spectrum of color. Every movie has its own spectrum of color. And we need to at least be aware of that color, because certain colors make us feel certain ways, and they're designed to have certain effects on the viewer. So we do need to be sort of aware of that. A lot of times color and the tones of different colors will be influenced by a lot of stuff that we're not going to get into, like film gauge, film stock, exposure, manipulation of exposure, choices in printing. If any of you are into photography, you might know a little bit about some of that, but we're not going to get into so much of the technical side. But we do need to be aware of colors and the effects that they have. And when we're thinking about color, we can think also about lighting, which is usually supervised by somebody on the film set referred to as the gaffer or the head electrical technician. A lot of times lighting will get classified under cinematography, because often the cinematographer is sort of in charge of the lighting guys, even though they have sort of their own department, their own hierarchy. But during the production process, oftentimes the cinematographer is sort of controlling the lighting. But we can also consider lighting as a separate entity, and if it has a big impact on shadow, contrast, tone, color, we can talk about lighting independently of camera work. But again, we see here that, it's part of these attributes of the camera shot. So when we're talking about camera work, we can also talk about lighting. But again, sometimes lighting can be talked about on its own. It doesn't always have to get thrown in to cinematography, but it often does. And then finally, our fourth and final attribute of the camera shot is camera movement. And this might be the easiest one to talk about in your own work. So we're just talking about how the camera moves. Is it trying to recreate regular human movement? Do you notice the camera moving in individual shots, or is the camera mostly stationary? Does it mostly remain still and we're just watching stuff unfold from that stationary position? Again, camera movement will often be determined by how old the film is. A lot of contemporary film, there is a lot of camera movement. There's a lot of dynamic movement that keeps us interested and seems exciting. Older movies, in addition to having longer shot durations, they also tend to have more static camera work. So you'll have more stationary cameras. Not always, but that was more common, 50 years ago. Now we like to keep things moving at a very crisp pace. So we typically do see a lot of movement, but not every shot will have movement. A lot of shots don't. Especially, again, long shots, establishing shots, a lot of medium shots and close-ups. they're stationary, right? Because we just want to see the face. We just want to see the shoulders and the head. But when characters are moving, oftentimes the camera might be moving with them. So there's lots of different types of movement that we can talk about. Pans and tilts are very common. We're going to see those a lot. So with a pan, we're going from side to side. We're sort of tracking the action, following it, maybe turning and following it as it moves. So we might be following some of the actors as they move on screen. So you're kind of moving on that, on sort of a horizontal axis, moving from side to side. Whereas a tilt is when the camera is moving up or down. So again, maybe going from a high perspective to a low, or a low perspective to a high, moving more on a vertical axis. Okay, but those are two common types of camera movement. So we also could find tracking shots. These are pretty common as well. That's where we follow the subject. We follow the actor, the character who's moving. We follow them forward or even backward as the camera sort of creates this sensation, sort of simulates movement. And oftentimes to create those tracking shots, you have to mount the camera on a dolly. And then grips are actually moving that dolly, or it might be on a track, or it might be pulled by something, but often they're moving that dolly on wheels, and they are literally following the subject of the shot, either forward or backward. So I posted some kind of famous examples of tracking shots. One that a lot of people know, if you've seen the film Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese. This is way after he made it big, so he had big budgets. He was making movies for big studios. That's a 1990 film. There's a famous tracking shot as Ray Liotta and Lorraine Bracco, who plays his future wife, as they go into this nightclub. The camera follows them as they go in this sort of labyrinth back way, because of course Liotta, Henry Hill in the movie, is handing out money. Everybody knows him. He's a gangster. He gets to do what he wants. But we have this really sort of virtuoso tracking shot as we follow them through all these hallways and the kitchen, and then they finally arrive on the main floor to hear some comedian, and they get their own table and everything, and it's one long unbroken shot. There's no cuts within that tracking shot. So if you watch it, you'll notice I can't remember exactly how long it is, but it's several minutes long, and there's dialogue and there's a lot of action. You can see how difficult it would have been to stage that all as one continuous shot. Really kind of just like a masterwork of cinematography, and it also conveys a lot of meaning. So when we talk about cinematography, when we're talking about different types of camera movement or different kinds of shots or even color, all of that is conveying meaning. All of that should have some connection to the thematic material of the film that we're talking about, or some larger effect on audience members. So always keep that in mind. We don't want to just talk about cinematography for the sake of talking about it. We want to talk about it to make some larger point about what the movie is doing, what the movie is saying, and how the movie is impacting viewers. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it for cinematography. Oh yeah, just one more thing for movement. Also, you can notice zooms. Sometimes we zoom in, we move closer to the subject, and sometimes we zoom out. We go away from the subject. So that's another type of common camera movement that you can look for and discuss. Okay, so let's move on to some other terms that should be good for cinematography. Next, we'll visit mise-en-scene. Okay, this is a French term. You don't have to try to pronounce it the right way. It's just a very blanket term that we need to think about when we're thinking about the look or the sort of visual aesthetic of a movie. So this is a French term that basically just means placement in scene. Okay, so it refers to everything that is visible on screen. Everything that we see, all the scenic elements of a film. So that includes the actors, of course. That includes all aspects of lighting. So again, we can separate lighting from cinematography because we also see the lighting. We see sets, we see set decorations, we see costumes, we see makeup. We see all of that. So basically, mise-en-scene refers to all of the visual elements that exist independently of cinematography and editing. So let me say that again. Mise-en-scene refers to all the visual elements that are separate, that can be considered separately from camera work and editing. Okay, so we're kind of removing those two things and everything else is fair game. So that means, again, makeup, costumes, set design, and also lighting and anything else that's visible on screen. So there's a lot that we can think about here, but typically if we're really interested in mise-en-scene, that means that we're really going to get into talking about set design. That's ultimately where this path takes us. So set design usually falls under the supervision of a person called the production designer. And working under that person, working under the production designer, is typically the art department. And the art department is responsible for doing a lot of the work that goes into the visuals that we will later see. So the art department, they're creating the sets. They're constructing the sets that are going to be used. We know that some films are filmed on location, but even those typically will have at least a few interior sets that they have to use. Sets, creating the look or feel of a house, a bar, a restaurant, wherever we're supposed to be, a battlefield, that takes a lot of work. And that usually falls to the art department. So they're creating the sets, constructing the sets, they're arranging props, and they're pretty much creating the overall on-screen appearance of the film. You also have a costume designer who's responsible for the costumes. You have people in charge of hair and makeup. So it's a very extensive part of the filmmaking process. Sometimes you'll have a production designer who's in charge of all of that, and then the art design or the art director kind of works under the production designer. But on smaller movies with smaller budgets, the art director and production designer might be pretty much the same person. But in bigger budget films, you'll have more of a sort of hierarchy, more of a delegation of duties. So it just kind of depends. But again, if you're thinking about set design, yeah, you really do have a lot you can do with that. And then you can even branch off and really focus more on hair, makeup, and costumes, because those matter too, especially if we're watching period pieces, which I don't think we are in this class. But if you're watching something that's, set in the 18th century, it's important that they get the costumes, the hair right. A lot of the authenticity that goes into historical dramas, recreations of past times, a lot of that falls on that particular side of filmmaking. And again, the sets, they need to look right. They need to be accurate in order for that visual appearance to be a success. So that's all part of mise-en-scene. Also, lighting. You can always talk about lighting. And finally, the way that actors move. You can talk about the appearance of the actors, their hair, their makeup, their clothes, that's fine. But you can also think about the way they move, because almost all movement of actors has to be choreographed, it has to be designed, it has to be planned. So the arrangement of the actors' movements is called blocking. And that's a concept that kind of carried over from stage plays, from theater. Blocking is very, very important in theater, and it's obviously very noticeable because we're sitting right there, we're closer. But it's also important on a movie set. everything has to be arranged, and movement has to be arranged. The way the actors move. All of that can be analyzed. So you can also choose to focus on blocking. Again, blocking just refers to how the actors move in a scene or how they move within a particular set, within a particular shot or a scene. And just to be clear, so an individual camera shot, again, very, very short, often 3 or 5 seconds. It's just usually a single image, and then we have a cut, and then we move to another shot. So when we have a bunch of shots sort of taken together, we can often arrive at a scene. Okay, so a scene consists usually of a bunch of different camera shots that will establish and sort of show the action in one place, sort of a continuous action that takes place sort of in a condensed time period and usually in one location. So, we can always isolate individual scenes when we're analyzing, and we can talk about an individual scene just like we would talk about an individual passage or an individual paragraph in a book. Right? Sort of works the same way. Some scenes are pretty short, some might stretch on for several minutes, but often they're determined by time and place. So, for example, at the beginning of a film, we might have several characters meeting at a diner. Okay, so that opening scene will probably just take place in the diner. We see people arrive. They sit at the table. They have a brief conversation. And then as they're paying to go, maybe our scene shifts and we go somewhere else. We go to a different place and it's a different time and there's different people doing different stuff, right? So that's how we know that one scene is ending and another scene is beginning. So again, there's no set number of shots that make up a scene. Sometimes a scene might only consist of a handful of shots, maybe just a couple of shots if they're really, if they're kind of longer shots. It doesn't take long to create a scene, but usually a scene is unified by a certain kind of unity of action and location. So we're in the same place, we're watching a continuous action unfold, and it's usually within a pretty condensed time period. And then once that action is complete, we go to a different time, a different place, and often different subjects, and we have a different scene. Or even if we stay with this group of people at the diner, the next scene might be them somewhere else. So it's the same people, but now they're doing something different at a different point in time in the next scene. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then we can also talk about sequences. And sequences will often consist of several scenes. And there's sort of a coherent little narrative that can be followed throughout the sequence. So again, this might be a handful of scenes showing a group of people doing several different things in different places at different times, but there's still a level of coherence. There's a level of unity when it comes to the stuff that they're doing or the motifs that are being sort of exhibited. So the shot is like an individual word or sentence. The sequence is like a passage or maybe even a short chapter. And then a sequence is a larger section within the overall movie. So a sequence might consist of multiple scenes. It might unfold over the span of 15 or 20 minutes. But we can still isolate individual shots, individual scenes, and individual sequences. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. Just to wrap up, I think I've covered mise-en-scene enough. Acting, well, we've already mentioned acting, but you can always talk about individual actors and their performances. That is an important part of analyzing film. We might want to notice the difference between what we consider like movie stars versus character actors. So movie stars are what we often find as our leading actors. They're often the protagonist or the main character. of a particular film. They're often celebrities. If it's a mainstream film, again, it kind of depends what we're watching. But if we're watching a big mainstream studio film in the multiplex, typically the lead role is going to go to somebody who's pretty famous, very beautiful, and they're often very gifted actors as well, but we might think of them as sort of often playing just like versions of themselves. I mean, that's often sort of said about, movie stars like Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt. They just sort of play different versions of their star persona. Might not be the real self, but their persona, and they play a lot of similar roles. That is often true. Meanwhile, character actors are very different. They usually show up in secondary roles. They are supporting actors. They're not usually the star, not usually the lead. Often they play sidekicks or best friends or the bad guy. They're often doing a lot of the heavy acting lifting because they're playing maybe more complex roles or less sympathetic roles that require a little bit more than just looking great and running fast and, fighting people. Not that those things aren't hard to do as well. But oftentimes character actors can become famous over time, but they're usually very distinctive looking, kind of unique in certain ways, and that sometimes bars them from a lot of leading roles, but they're really good in secondary roles. And we often recognize character actors because they show up in a lot of different movies, but we might not know their names. They're often not necessarily famous, but they can get famous. So like Steve Buscemi is often used as an example, and we're going to see him, I think we're going to see him, we'll see him in week 2. But he started his career as a character actor. I would argue he has been the leading man of a few films by now, but he still usually shows up in supporting roles. He's very distinctive looking, and people have come to know him, and he is pretty famous. But it took many years of working as a character actor. We can also think about different ways that actors sort of become the characters that they are portraying. This isn't as interesting to people now as maybe it was decades ago. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of actors who were considered to be method actors, like Marlon Brando and James Dean. And method acting just means that like you really disappear into your role. Like you start acting like your character all the time. So it's a more authentic performance. Sometimes Daniel Day-Lewis is considered sort of a modern day method actor. He's apparently done that or some version of that before. We might not really care about that. But again, sometimes the leading role, the star role, whether it's a male or female actor, often we think of the stars, even if again it could be like Reese Witherspoon, Julia Roberts, Sandra Bullock. We can kind of say the same thing that we said about Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. Like they often play similar characters, sort of versions of their persona. So that's a distinction that we can make between different maybe styles of acting, right? Really getting into a specific character versus just kind of playing a certain type of character and doing it in kind of a more general way. So we can always discuss acting, and then also let's think a little bit about the post-production process. So I mentioned before that once the shooting of the film is done, we move into post-production, which consists of editing, visual effects, and music. And those are all very important parts of the overall film. So when we talk about editing, we're talking about the process by which different shots are linked together during the post-production process. And like I mentioned earlier, in the modern day, we usually see a pretty fast-paced editing style. And a lot of scholars will point to the rise of commercials and music videos starting in the 1980s as really part of why we began to edit more and more rapidly, because they sort of introduced a more sort of exciting, visually exciting, fast-paced style, and later movies and TV sort of picked up on that. So again, if you're noticing that none of the individual camera shots last longer than 3 to 5 seconds, that means that the film is edited in a fairly fast-paced manner. Because if you ever actually watch a movie shot, you'll notice that a lot of the shots are longer, like they have a lot more footage, but a lot of that is getting cut during the editing process. So I might let the camera roll, on this medium shot a little bit longer after we see this character for the first time. But then during the editing process, the editor's like, okay, after we see this guy for 2 seconds, I'm cutting to the next shot. We don't need to look at this guy for 5 seconds. We just need 2 seconds. So that's the kind of work that gets done during the editing process. And also, films are usually shot out of sequence. Usually, you don't film the first scene first and then the last scene last. There can be exceptions, but usually movies are shot out of sequence. And that means the editor or the editors, there's sometimes more than one, that means they have to put it all together. They actually have to assemble it in a chronological fashion. So a lot of work, a lot of important work gets done during post-production. And there are some directors who are kind of notorious for just shooting a ton of footage and just having a ton of shots. And they redo the same shot, the same take over and over again. And then the editor has to get in there and find what we're going to keep and what we're going to cut. And sometimes that can be a very difficult process. So we can always talk about editing, and we can also talk about individual editors because they are important roles. And finally, I just wanted to mention music. We can always talk about the impact of music. Most movies have soundtracks. Again, a lot of that work is getting done during post-production. So sometimes you might have an individual person who is responsible for the score or the soundtrack. In other cases, the director might have a big hand in it. It kind of depends. There might be some original songs composed for the film, or they might just use popular music. Of course, you have to acquire the rights to anything that you use, but they might just acquire, popular songs, and that's what we hear on the soundtrack. So music matters. We're going to talk a little bit about music when we get into Stranger Than Paradise. We don't hear a lot of different songs in that movie, but we hear one song a lot, and it obviously has a pretty important thematic role to play. And it has a lot to do with characterization and some other things too. So music's always fair game. If the music is important to you, if individual songs on the soundtrack are important to you, then you might want to figure out who's the composer, who did the score, who's responsible for the soundtrack, and you can talk about that person as well. Okay, so that is it for the introduction. Please come back maybe tomorrow or later on when you're less sick of me to watch the week 1 lecture, the regular week 1 lecture. That's where we get into Stranger Than Paradise, directed by Jim Jarmusch.